We stream live on LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube, and you can listen to us on your favorite podcast platforms. Marketing Demystified, the podcast, is presented to you by GrowGetter, your partner in growth marketing. And here's today's episode.
Hello, everyone. Are you ready to be inspired, informed, and empowered with actionable tips to transform your marketing game? You are in the right place. Welcome to Marketing Demystified. I'm your host, Jenn Mancusi, CEO and co-founder of GrowGetter, your growth marketing partner. Now, relationships matter when driving businesses forward, and one way to nurture relationships is through online conversations. But what are the best strategies to have relevant and authentic online conversations with customers and potential customers? To discuss this topic, I'm joined by Brooke Sellas, founder and CEO of B Squared Media and an expert in online conversations. Welcome to the show, Brooke.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. Very excited to have this conversation about conversations.
We'll have a little online conversation about other online conversations and see where that takes us. I love that.
Exactly. It's very meta, but I promise it'll make sense by the time we're done.
Totally. So let's kick it off. When we say online conversations, what falls into that category? Is what we're doing now, does that fall into the online conversation category?
Definitely. I think it's just a way of kind of like defining the channel, right? So if it's online, if it happens in a digital channel, like this live stream or social media or a chatbot on your website, I would call that an online conversation, right? It's not happening in real life, quote unquote, where somebody's in front of you and you can see them, touch them if you wanted to. It's just a way to describe the medium, which is through digital media.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it sounds like, there's like different formats, right? This is a actual live conversation where we're communicating back and forth in real time, but a chatbot is written communication, or maybe there's automated, like I guess what are some of the different formats then too? Because this could kind of be exponential, right?
It could be, yeah. So, a lot of times on a website, you might be chatting with a bot, right? Which is obviously not a human. It's AI powered. It works off of conversational workflows or generative AI, as we've all been playing with. Hopefully, you've been playing with it. It's really cool. But it could also happen on social media, right? More and more people are using social media as a support channel. I'm sure you've seen this, meaning for the most part, more and more people are going to social media to complain, right, about a service or a product, but it's not always complaints or support conversation. Some people have live chat on their websites. So this is where you're actually chatting with someone in usually customer support or service who's on the other side of that keyboard typing with you, kind of answering your questions. But then, of course, you could get on a meeting like this. And I think, we're going to even expand into bigger areas of online conversation, because I think what will be coming, and I wrote about this in our soon to be released State of Social Care report, you will be able to get on live with, like, let's say a plumber, if you're having a very basic issue where they can kind of walk you through a AI or VR, AR, and show you how to fix that problem. So I think the online conversation world is rapidly expanding with AR, VR, and artificial intelligence. And this is why it's so important to kind of get good now at the places that you already have a presence, so then you can prepare for what's coming.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Like an expert kind of getting on and being able to share how to do certain things or respond to service or complaints or things like that. I've seen some really interesting, you mentioned generative AI. It's not always generative AI. Sometimes it's bots, but some really interesting applications in like interviewing, and especially in our world, a lot of our audience here and our clients that we work with are in the market research space. And there's a lot of like live conversations that used to be done with a human that are now, the bots are even actually better at digging deeper on some of these questions because they're not afraid to ask why 17 times in a row.
Yeah.
Root cause. So yeah, there's some really interesting applications that keep emerging, and it's important to stay on top of all those new developments.
Definitely. I mean, I think as, generations switch over and take place from one another, we're just going to see the growing use of digital channels to have conversations. Whether people want to talk to a bot or not is really like a hyper personalization question. There is some research by Generation, kind of calling out which digital channels they would prefer to use. But at the end of the day, it really does come down to your personal choice. So I think, hyper personalization is another area where brands will want to get smart. That's going to tell you which of your customers want to converse with you on which platforms. Even though I'm Gen X, I may very well, and I am honestly, be fine with talking to you through social media because that's what I do for my day job, right? So I'm not necessarily an email person. I'm more of a social person, but that's my preference. Someone else who is also Gen X could have a very different preference. So I think understanding channel of choice, as we call it, by customer sounds hard, but it's really important in the upcoming months and years.
Yeah, and I feel like also, like, there's been a lot of conversation in the last several years as more research has come out about Gen Z, more specifically about the expectation of like consistent experiences across digital and live channels.
Yeah.
And that's something like really specific to that generation. But I think to your point, even more hyper personalization to the individual of like, you have to make sure you're providing consistent experiences in person and online, but that expectation varies based on who it is that you're talking to. So that's so critical to understand like the the channels where you're reaching the right people. I mean, none of this is like new stuff, right? This is marketing basics. Understand your audience and meet them where they are, but it's just it always changing the application of that concept.
Right. Right. I mean, channel of choice, I think, is the biggest X factor there, right? Because we keep getting all of these new digital channels. And, you know, there might be some people who prefer to reach out to you on TikTok and you don't have a TikTok presence. Is it worth going and creating a TikTok presence, right? Even though you have one customer that's reaching out to you on that channel for support. So I think, again, going back to hyper-personalization, part of knowing that is knowing the channel of choice by customer. And again, I'm not saying this is easy, but it's something we should be considering as we put together our strategies and update strategies for understanding audience and then also understanding channel of choice by customer.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. So, as we, as you mentioned, like some of these conversations actually happen with a human being, some happen with like a pre programmed bot. Sometimes there's something in between, which is more generative and more reactive. But what are some best practices for businesses to actually build authentic connections and foster engagement through online conversations, even when there isn't always maybe a human on the other side?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think, first and foremost, if we're talking about bots, you need to know what your frequently asked questions are, right? These are the easy layup questions that really almost any business has. So are you open today? Where are you located? What are your hours? If you're a retail location, what sizes do you carry? Do you carry shoes in this size? Understanding what some of those frequently asked questions are allow you to become more efficient with the human conversations because the bot can answer those FAQs 100% right. So, right all the time with 100% accuracy, and they can do it 24/7, right? They never need a break, they never have to eat, all of those wonderful things, which then should allow you to free up time for human agents who can get into those conversations that might be a little more difficult or tricky to answer. So, for instance, we work with a large tech brand. They have 12 different product lines, and we don't use a bot beyond the very basic FAQs because the conversations that we end up having, on social channels are complex, right? It would be a little bit frustrating for a bot to come through, and ultimately, what we found is when their particular customer comes through to ask these questions, they're already frustrated, right? Because they're having a tech issue. So it's not the best time to have a bot take over. They really need that hand holding and that human empathy and understanding to go along with that conversation. So to your point about human conversations, I think the first thing is just to look. You would be surprised at how many brands just don't even understand what types of conversations are happening on their social media channels. So I would, if I were you and I was just starting out, I would go out to all of my social channels and create an audit. how many channels are happening each day, each week, each month on each of our channels. And then I would look at the types of conversations that people are having. Are they support, right? They've already bought something and they're complaining, or they need help, or whatever it may be. They need a refund, they need to return something. Or is it acquisition or sales support, meaning they're in that buying moment and they're asking you questions about your product or your service that will help them make a purchase decision.
Yeah, that's such a critical distinction between like what are people wanting to have a conversation with you about, because a lot of times it's the automation is optimized for what the business wants, which is, you're thinking that people are there to buy from you and that's what it's set up to do. And when somebody is showing up there with a service challenge and that need isn't getting met, like, that's a big disconnect. And also I think what you said about kind of automating the FAQs and then leveraging humans for the more complex conversations that need to be had is really important. But I mean, this might be a really tactical question, but how do you even think about the routing for that? Because I've just, as a consumer, had so many experiences where I'm like representative, right? Like
Yeah, it's
let me tell
frustrating.
you, right?
Yeah.
I know your bot's not going to solve my problem because I've already decided it's too complex. And some systems aren't set up to do that well. So how do you recommend like routing people? How quickly, like how long do you give the bot to decide it needs to turn over to a human?
Yeah, I mean, I think every bot, whether it's just one of those like basic conversational workflow bots, which essentially is not generative AI, it answers questions based on what we call a workflow.
Mhm.
And so we put in keyword phrases. When the bot sees that keyword phrase, it knows what response to deliver. So no matter, again, if we're talking about that basic bot or generative AI, which can come up with its own answers, I would say make sure you always have a human option on your menu of options. Oftentimes you'll go into a bot and it'll have a menu like, what are you trying to do? Make sure you always have a human option in that menu. And then again, like you were saying in your example, just if somebody's saying representative, you need to have the ability to route them with a human right then and there. Or I get that some businesses, can't do this, have a response ready to go that says, our humans are sleeping right now. It's 12 a.m. And unfortunately, they're so annoying. They have to sleep, eat, and do other things. So we'll have someone reach back out to you tomorrow during business hours or the next business day during business hours. Whatever you can do, make sure that you note that within how long you'll get back or what the response time should be or the expected response time should be. And then make sure you actually do what you say. So if it's, the next business day within business hours and you reach out 2 days later, that's not going to work. You might as well change it to say within the next 2 business days within business hours.
Yeah, those are great tips. That's super helpful. Um, So now thinking about like the purpose of actually driving business value through online conversations, like what types of conversations are actually driving the most value?
Yeah, it's funny. It's those path to purchase questions or
Mm.
sales support questions. So when I was writing my book, Conversations That Connect, a couple of years ago, as I was in the research phase, I went to all of our customer care clients and I said, I'm curious, like how much of the social chatter do you think, based on all of the channels that you have, social media channels that you have, how much of it do you think is retention, meaning support, right? They're already a customer, they're already asking a support question. And how much of it do you think is sales support or acquisition, like in that buying moment? And across the board, they all said 0 to 5% of the conversation would be acquisition. But when we went through and started to label and audit all of their channels, what we found was that not a single one of them had less than 20% acquisition happening on their social channels, which is shocking. And so what that meant was they didn't know these conversations were happening. They weren't addressing these, potential sales conversations. They weren't able, tagging them as such, which helps quantify what's happening out there on social. If you need budget for, a customer care team or an internal customer care agent, whatever it may be. So I think starting with that little audit that I just kind of described earlier is a great place to go because I think you'd be surprised at how much acquisition chatter there is. That tech brand that I mentioned has 4 out of the 12 product lines that have anywhere from 60 to 80% acquisition chatter month over month. So think about that. That's money sitting on the table. And honestly, the fastest brand to reply, because as consumers, we know that I'm asking your brand that question, but I'm also asking your other top 3 competitors that question. And what we see is usually the first to reply with a helpful answer is the one who gets the business.
Oh, 100%. That's like across the board, no matter what. You're never just reaching out to one company. I mean, rarely, right? And it
Right.
is whoever gets in touch the fastest, because again, as a consumer, like if you don't reach me when I'm thinking about buying the thing, I've moved on to something else a day later or several hours later. So even if there is a response within, let's say, 3-4 hours, I'm most likely moved on to something else in my day. Everybody's so busy and context shifting, and so important to have that immediate response. But it's so interesting to me that such a high percentage of these conversations are happening about sales and acquisition without anybody even knowing about it.
Right. And so, like, a lot of people will say, well, that doesn't apply to me because, my product is more money. It always comes down to price for my product. And I tell this story as an anecdote, but when my husband and I bought our first home together, we sent a letter of intent with the offer. We were the first offer in, but not the highest offer. And they chose us because they literally, we talked to the agents and they said it was because we were first and because of our intent letter. So I think that gives a great example. We're not just talking about a $5 product. That was a home, that was much more expensive than in most products or services that we tend to buy. But because we were first and because we were so helpful with that letter of intent, we painted that picture. So if you're responding first with an extremely helpful answer, not trying to sell necessarily, but with an extremely helpful answer, you should be the first one to get the purchase or the customer.
Sure. And why do you think these things tend to fall through the cracks? Like, is it like a lack of ownership? Like, where should the onus sit in a company? Like, what what division, what role is responsible
Mhm.
for making sure this is all really tight? Is it an ops role? Is it a marketing role? Like, what do you think?
You're hitting the nail on the head, Jen, because there is like a who owns this argument that we see happening in a lot of companies. So there's 2 factors. There's the who owns this factor, and then there's the inherent mismatch of employees, right? Employees at companies typically work Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. They don't work after hours, holidays, and weekends, which, by the way, is when most people come to social to complain because they are not at work. But I think from the who owns this perspective, it's everyone's job. If I had my way, every company and every employee within that company or that brand would take on the mindset of customer experience is everyone's job. And the companies who we work with who do have that kind of mantra or mindset, we find are much more successful. But ultimately, no matter who owns it, somebody needs to own it. Typically, it's like marketing or a social media team. But if you don't have the resources internally to meet the demand of social, which is, 24/7, and that's difficult, then consider doing a hybrid approach, which is where you outsource some of it to a company like B Squared Media, and we plug in and we help you, build out all of these cool processes and things and make sure that you're answering your customers or potential customers 365 days a year so that you're never missing out on this opportunity to retain and or acquire new customers.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a resource challenge, but there's so much to be left on the table if not done
Yeah.
properly. And I think that, like, really, that I totally agree with you. Customer experience needs to be everyone's job and everyone's focus. And I think that's where sometimes things do slip through the cracks, because you kind of also need one person to say, Brooke, I need you to respond to this.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, and listen, you don't have to outsource. Brands are getting it done. I was at an event in New York City around this time last year, so about a year ago,
Yeah.
and I spoke to a woman who works at Chipotle. And Chipotle has a team of internal people who they're set up to work weekends. They rotate shifts and things like that, but it's a small team and they just set it up to make sure that somebody's there to answer. They made it happen because as Chipotle and, fast food brands and food brands in particular, your consumers are asking questions literally 24/7 about your products and services or complaining, and they just knew that they needed to meet that demand on that channel of choice at that time, that as immediately as they could.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Um, so, aside from maybe things slipping through the cracks or things getting missed or that lack of understanding of the types of conversations, like what are some of the mistakes that companies are commonly making when they're actually trying to engage in these conversations and drive business? Like where does that part struggle?
I think to your point earlier, Jen, it's always about the sell. If you're the brand, right? It's always about like, oh, let's close this customer. But I really think it's more of a consultative selling role. And if you know anything about consultative selling, it's really just listening first and really listening well, not just listening to respond, but actively listening for those pain points. And then it's providing a solution, whether it's your solution or not, based on those pain points that you actively listened to. And if your product or service meets those pain points, all of them, not just 1 out of 3 or whatever it is, then you can try to make the sale. So it would look something like this in the real world. Let's say, Jen comes to that tech brand's Twitter page and says, hey, I'm wondering if this printer model is compatible with Alexa. And the brand would come through and be like, hey, Jen, yes, actually, it is compatible with Alexa. Here's a video on how that works. Let us know if that's helpful. Jen comes back and says, yeah, that was really helpful. Thank you. And they say, oh, you're so welcome. And Jen, if you buy this printer within the next 7 days using this promo code, we'll send you a free ink pack along with the printer. Now, if Jen uses that promo code, guess what? You now have attribution. You get to tag that new revenue and that new customer to organic social media or social care or whatever you call it within your organization. And once you start quantifying the revenue that's happening on social channels, that your stakeholders start to pay attention and give you more budget for those channels. So, it's just following a process to, attribute everything properly, help people in a consultative selling kind of way, not always selling, but when it's needed, and then being able to attribute that so that you can quantify what you're able to do through social media and those online conversations.
You are really speaking my language. It's like these are the two things I believe in the most as a marketer, really for any channel. Like it's about relationship and attribution.
Yeah.
Like there is almost never a case, especially like, we kind of operate in the B2B space, a lot of
Mhm.
like longer sales cycles, higher price tags. So nobody is ever visiting your website for the very first time and making a purchase online. That
Right.
just doesn't exist.
Right.
Like maybe in the consumer side, you see an ad on Instagram, I'm guilty, right? You buy it right
Not me.
away.
Yeah.
But not typically in a B2B sale, and especially not like a SaaS subscription type sale. Um,
Mhm.
so it's so important to nurture a relationship with people that are in your funnel. And if somebody's coming and asking questions, it's the moment to listen, it's the moment to be useful and be helpful and provide solutions, but it's not like there's no hard selling anymore, right? Like it's just we don't live in that
Mm-mm.
world anymore, and attribution is critical. It's the only way we know if marketing is working, because marketing is so different today than it was
Yes.
a month ago, a year ago, 10 years ago, and it's going to
Mhm.
be different tomorrow. So having that foundation of tracking the results of everything you do is the only way that you can have a smart strategy. And I think that's what you're saying. It applies for online
Oh,
conversations too and organic.
absolutely. And if you want the advanced version of that, you could take that data, right? That raw conversation, and then because you know who's closing, right? Closed won data. If we're
Mhm.
talking sales speak, and you could feed that into AI if you're allowed, right? I always make that like little caveat. You have to be allowed to use AI or have your own AI. But you could take all those data sets, and if you have that closed won or closed loss data, did they use the promo code and buy, or did they not? You can start to ask AI things like, hey, show me gaps or patterns and trends with all of this conversational data. This is a tool that we're actually building right now for B Squared Media as a proprietary tool. But ultimately, what we hope this tool will do through AI is to say things like, when someone asks this way and you answer with these words and this promo code, you have a 10x higher chance of closing the deal, right? Because then we're able to take all this customer data or voice of customer data and apply it not just on social, but with all of our sales and marketing messages. Does that make sense? Like, it's really powerful to have these conversations because they can do so much more than just perpetuate more online conversations. They can give you really valuable data across the business and across really any department.
Yeah. And that type of data is so, like, that's so exciting, right? You could never track that in a world where we're having all of our meetings in person, and, you know, we're signing contracts on napkins and bars. Like, you just would never have that data. So the fact that things are so much more digital and so much more virtual and AI driven than ever before, that's the, you know, as much as you lose some connection there, you gain
Yeah.
in so much intelligence, and if it's used properly, can really completely change your strategy, which is amazing.
Yeah, I think, invest in the AI for the data, but keep the conversation human is what I would say.
Mhm. I love that. That's such a great tip. Now, how important do you think it is for, I mean, we touched on this briefly, like customer experience should be everyone's job, right? But how important is it for like leaders of businesses and executives and the C-suite to actually, like, on the ground participate in these conversations themselves?
Yeah, well, I think if we look at the research, right? There's so much research out there that shows when the CEO or somebody from the C-suite gets involved with some of these online conversations, for the most part, as long as they're, keeping their nose clean, they these reports and this research shows that there is an uptick in, people perceiving the brand as a good brand, people following the brand, people engaging with the brand. So I think that's one factor. I think another factor is we still don't talk to our customers enough. You know, my job essentially is like a customer experience consultant, but through digital mediums, mostly social media. And I'll ask clients all the time, like, when's the last time you talked to your customers? And inevitably, I mostly hear it's been a long time. And they'll say, when I say why, they'll give excuses like, oh, well, it's hard to go visit people in person, or I don't have time to pick up the phone. But I really feel like any executive or stakeholder can and should look at least these online conversations, right? They may not have to get involved. They can do it in a more passive way, which may kind of get them over the hump of actually doing it. But even from a passive look at these raw conversations, or maybe some of that closed won, closed loss data, when you can quantify what's happening with either retention or acquisition through digital channels, get that stakeholder involved, and then also paint the story of, and Jenn bought from us because we showed her that video and gave her the promo for the free ink package. That's storytelling on the back end with data that I think helps with the stakeholders and C-suite.
Yeah, totally. And I think too, like, there's decisions that are made directly from those conversations and from that data. And I think there's also decisions that are made indirectly,
Mm.
just based on the fact that you're more ingrained in the customer. Like, a business that's truly customer centric, if the CEO is either having those customer conversations or reading them or listening to them on a daily basis, is just like immersed in the customer, then
Mhm.
every decision that they make is benefiting from hearing customer stories or challenges or requests on a daily basis. So, there's some things where it's like, oh, we have this data. We want to see close loss, close one. Let's make a decision about what video to make next, right? That's
Yeah.
a very direct correlation with doing that analysis, but just the nature of looking at it regularly, it's like,
It's important. Yeah. Well, and I think also we tend to, as marketers, want to like uplift all of the good, positive data that we have. But I would say, from a conversational standpoint, start with the negative. The negative is really where you have the only catalyst for change. If everybody that was, speaking of your brand or speaking to your brand on social media had something positive to say, everybody's out of a job. We have nothing left to do, right? Just to churn out this product and keep moving forward. But because people come to social to complain, and because you have the power, the stakeholders, the C-suite, to make that change. So if you constantly hear negative, conversation on social about your checkout function or your cart function, you have the power to go fix that. And then what's even better is going out and saying, we heard what you said because we were actively listening, and we solved this by doing X. People will love you for it, because how many brands are out there really truly listening to what their customers want, and then listening to those pain points and making changes based on those pain points? Very few. So you're talking about a really easy way to differentiate your brand from other brands, but also just to make your customers more loyal, right? By saying, like, we listened, we knew you didn't like it, so we fixed it. That's
Mm-hmm.
it.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's such a good tip. It is hard to look at the negative stuff, but if you can fix it, it's like the gold
Yeah.
standard. I heard somebody say that to me years ago about journey mapping. Like, you should actually find the friction point and journey map
Yes.
the friction. Don't journey map the like
Yes.
desired outcome, right? If you can find the path to that where it all falls apart, then you can actually fix it, which I just thought was brilliant at the time. It really stuck with me.
Yeah, it makes so much sense. When I hear people talk about CX, oftentimes they explain customer experience as like rolling out the red carpet for every single customer. And I don't know about you, but that was stressing me out, right? When people describe it that way, I'm like, how on earth do you scale rolling out the red carpet for every customer? So I changed my mindset. And for me, and in the book, I call those friction points potholes in the digital customer journey. And if we can fix those potholes on the path to purchase and make it, 2 clicks easier to make that purchase, or whatever that outcome to the pain point or solution to the pain point is, that's what customer experience means to me. It's making that path to purchase shorter, easier, and the best delivery of it that you can have it be.
For sure. Yeah. I love that description of them as potholes. That's such an easy, visual to
We've
kind of
all driven over potholes. Well, I think most of us have, and they're terrible. Just fix it.
right. Totally. Yeah. Some are easier to fix than others, right? And some are
True.
more damaging than others. It's such a
Very
great
true.
analogy. So now what sort of like technologies or platforms or maybe things that are emerging are showing the most promise for businesses to drive value and growth through online conversations?
Yeah, I think, the obvious answer here is artificial intelligence, and specifically when I'm talking about, taking the data and doing something really important with it, or making solutions with it, or making change with it. I think that predictive AI, so predictive modeling, like we kind of talked about with the closed won, closed lost, using predictive AI to help you understand things that it would take a research team, years to understand. The example that I give, and that comes from one of the tools that we use, is a company wanted to understand why employees left the company. And they all thought, which I think makes a lot of common sense, that it had to do with title or salary. And when they put this data set into the modeling predictive AI software, what they actually found was there was a direct correlation between the number of training hours an employee had received and their chances to stay with the company. So employees that had received 15 hours or more of training were like 80% more likely to stay with the company. That's something they didn't know. It's something, again, yes, you could have had a team of research people on that, but I think it would have taken a very long time for those researchers to come to that conclusion. So I think, using the power of AI in analytics is what every company should be looking at AI to do at this point in time.
Yeah, I totally agree. There's such an opportunity there. And I think a lot of the analytics tools that have been around for a long time are changing, just with, cookie policies changing and privacy laws changing. So
Yeah.
it's now's the time to start transitioning and start using some of the new technology that's out there.
Yeah.
And as the old technology becomes less valuable, I guess that's that's kind
Yeah.
of the space where it is. We're in a huge transition from a data perspective when it comes to marketing analytics.
Well, and you bring up a great point with third-party cookies. The tracking information that a lot of brands use to, retarget and get new customers. Most advertisers, if you're running ads, and you're 9 times out of 10, I can confidently say without even looking at your internal analytics that most of your ads, most of your like revenue is coming from retargeting, right? But now that those third-party cookies are going away, we have to think about first-party data that we own, that the company owns, right? When someone subscribes to your newsletter, that's first-party data. You own the right to market to that person. Well, how do we get more first-party information? Online conversations. The key to first party data is first party relationships. So I think the brands that understand the power of these online conversations and all of that data that they can collect from people is going to be vastly important when third party cookies are completely removed from the menu of options that we have as marketers.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. That first party data is so critical. Now, as you're talking about some of these like capabilities, do you have any favorite platforms or emerging platforms we should be looking out for?
Yeah, so the tool that I mentioned for predictive analytics is called, I'm probably butchering the name, but it's called Akkio, Akkio. So just look up, you can Google Akkio AI, and that is the predictive analytics tool. Again, I have to say, the big caveat or disclaimer here is like, if you're on the marketing team and you're working for a company, don't go just download that and start entering in sensitive client data. Make sure you understand like what the rules and regulations are around AI with your company. And if you don't have any yet, I still think it's really important to find out what they are, because this tool is a closed source tool, meaning it doesn't share the data you share with it out into other tools like ChatGPT or open source tools. But still, I think you have to be very, very careful about the information you share through AI. So first, make sure you understand that you have permission from your company. Second, make sure you have permission from your customers, or make sure that any kind of identifiers about those customers are scrubbed from that list. And then once you know those two things are absolutely crystal clear, you're 100% sure, then you could go use a really cool tool like Akkio.
That's good. Good recommendations. I know a lot of companies are in the process now of creating these
Yeah.
policies. And so there's so many tools out there. It's important to read the terms and conditions and just make
Mhm.
sure that you're being responsible with data. That's good suggestions.
Yeah, 100%. I think we're all scrambling, but it's
A little
just,
bit.
for as marketers, we want to make sure we're following like privacy guidelines.
For
So,
sure. Yeah, 100%. This is baseline, right? We don't want to be feeding any proprietary data into the internet. So
oh no, please don't.
let's let's be careful about that. Well, thank you so much. This was such a great online conversation, and so good to like kind of hear about how people can optimize and audit and use the data from these conversations to do better business. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me and allowing other people to hear what I think is a really important conversation to have.
Absolutely. Thanks everybody for tuning in today. I'll be back with another episode in a couple weeks where I'm chatting with Asia Orion